So while this is kind of a normal conservative talking point you see brought up a lot, that doesn't mean it's not true. That doesn't mean it's not important. And that doesn't mean they're not right about it, even if their solutions don't make a lot of sense. And I feel there's a lot of spin on this. So I'm going to try to kind of give you the brutally honest, unideological view of why we're doomed and why it can't be fixed. And the Cliff Notes answer is that there's two ways to get us out of this crisis. Theoretically, cutting spending or raising taxes. Both are politically impossible or economically unworkable, or both. They largely can't be done. So if you can't cut spending or raise revenue, then there's no way to close the deficit, except for the growth cope, but we'll talk about the growth cope later. Okay, so a big note. I'm not going to get too deep with exact numbers here. This is more about the broader picture and more about the proportions. It can be hard to find sources. Sometimes there's some for some years, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes they include certain things, sometimes they don't include other things. If you go through and start checking it, the numbers aren't going to exactly add up. Also, if I couldn't find the same year, I kind of mix them together, but it's probably only going to be a percentage or two difference. It's not particularly meaningful in the bigger picture. Also, for some of these, just because it was too hard to find it, I used ChatGPT. So I did do spot checks as I was going through this to try and make sure that it made sense and was in line with what I understood, but I doubt everything will be precise. Anyway, so let's start off with kind of the big picture of the big picture. This is debt to GDP ratio. So GDP, or gross domestic product, is the total economic value of an economy. It's the value of all goods and services produced within that economy in 1 year. The maximum economic potential output, if you will. And this is the amount of debt relative to that. So as you can see, some countries like the United States are well over 100%. That means even if every single dollar and iota of productivity produced within the United States in 1 year were put towards repaying the debt, it's impossible to pay it off. Now, you might say some of these countries look a bit off, but debt is a very hard thing to quantify because do you include external debt? Do you include debt owned by the central bank? Do you include local or state level debt? So it's, once again, just to kind of give you a broad idea. But as you can see, most Western countries and Japan are just basically screwed. They have massive levels of debt. And we'll get into this in a second, but this is pre the big rearmament program that Europe's going to have. So some countries that were relatively financially conservative, like Germany, are going to start running massive deficits. Ironically enough, Russia has one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios in the world. And I'm not sure if it really has any foreign debt. Maybe a little, but the experience of the 90s made them extremely fiscally conservative, ironically enough. So then the question is, though, okay, Arjun, you showed me that big picture. It looks bad. How bad could it be? Well, we have a graph. This is the G7. And I'm old enough that I still reflexively say G8 because Russia was in it before they got kicked out over the Georgia War. So yeah, so current debt levels now are higher than in World War II. Yes, think about that for a minute. We're more in debt now than during a cataclysmic global war that killed tens of millions of people. So I guess, like, if you have a total war versus Keynesian stimulus, it's better to have the total war fiscally for your country. So a lot of this comes down to, like I said, Keynesian economics. So what are Keynesian economics? It's funny because people who claim to be Keynesians today only use one half of Keynesian economics. So Keynes's idea is during recessions or depressions, government should spend money on infrastructure and other programs in order to get money into the economy, in order to get things moving again, in order to stimulate the economy. Okay, that makes sense. The problem is Keynes said, okay, once the economy starts working again, you're going to need to cut You're going to need to pay down the debt, and you're going to need take that fiscal stimulus away. The problem is with modern Keynesianism, spending goes up during a recession and spending goes up when there's not a recession. So it really doesn't resemble anything that Keynes came up with. The idea in his mind was to smooth out the business cycle. And the all-time winner of the Keynesian prize is probably Japan, which is at 263% debt to GDP ratio. But there's a lot of shenanigans and weird stuff involved with that, so it's not actually as bad as it seems. But yeah, pretty much since the 1970s, it's been a pretty steep climb up. So, how did this happen? Shockingly, debt increases when you spend more money. So over the last 150 years, government spending has steadily increased as a share of GDP, and now exceeds 40% in many countries. Just look at how much that's gone up. Particularly, a lot of it only really started during the 80s, if you look at it. Like we have World War I. Okay, that makes sense that there's a massive amount of spending increase. Okay, World War II, once again, that makes sense. Okay, we go back down, and then it just goes up. And then we have fiscal crisis, and then we have pandemic. And the percent of government spending is now higher than when we were in a global conflict. So that's cool. And once again, if we look at this, pretty much the entirety of the collective West has 40% or more of GDP coming from government spending. So, I mean, if we look at it, okay, people go, well, but Argent, there was some return to fiscal sanity. It went down a little bit after the fiscal crisis in some countries. Granted, the base level is higher now, so it maybe went up 20% during the fiscal crisis, and then it went down 16%. But that's something. That's progress. And the same thing seems to be happening with the pandemic relief funds. In some countries, they've cut it back to being about what it was previously. In other countries, that's the new baseline. And Lord knows if we have another depression or recession, how much it's going to go up. So the question we have to ask is, where is all the money going? And if we're spending all this money, why is so much stuff falling apart? Why are people poor? Why are people miserable? Why don't we have high-speed rail? Why don't we have colonies on Mars? Why does the U.S. Army not have basic equipment? And the answer is, of course, dem programs. But before that, just to add in, because I just to trying to put into perspective that the U.S. isn't the only country that has this. This is where the U.S. is with deficit as a percentage of GDP. In pretty much every collective West country, advanced excluding USA Eurozone, is at like 2% or more deficit of GDP. Germany had a law, I think Merz removed it, limiting it. And Canada had a very low level of debt to GDP ratio historically. That's gone out the window now. But anyways, my point is this is similar throughout the world. This is not a uniquely American problem. Okay, so where is the money going? The money is going to dem programs. And this is something I feel, I don't know if conservatives are ignorant about. I don't know if they're dishonest. I don't know if it's just purely rhetorical. But not that much money actually goes to the things that they claim it goes to. Only about 15% of the U.S. budget, and we'll look at it in a minute, and it's, I think, fairly similar in most developed countries, goes to goes to non-defense discretionary spending. But if it's 15% of the money, but it's 90% of the complaints. So that amounts to about $900 billion a year, which sounds like a lot until you keep in mind, like in the US, the deficit is $1.6 trillion a year. So even if you cut all of this evil discretionary spending, it wouldn't actually resolve the problem. Also, DEM programs have grown so much that defense spending has fallen from 20% of the federal budget to 13% of the federal budget. And given how much money the U.S. spends on the military, that really says something. Okay, so where is the money going? So mandatory spending is, if we look over here, Social Security, unemployment, and other programs, Medicare and health. I think that also includes Medicaid. We have veteran benefits. There's some transportation, food and agriculture. I'm not sure. I think food and agriculture is food stamps because I think food stamps are run out of the agricultural department. Also, stuff like government cheese. So, mandatory spending is spending that cannot be cut or reduced in a normal fashion. I'm not sure how it works exactly if you need a bigger majority or you need to pass specific legislation, but that is the baseline. That is something that you maybe can cut it or increase it, but you can't really move stuff around within it nearly as much. And if you actually look at the total breakdown of the budget, also net interest is basically mandatory because you kind of have to pay interest on your bills. So if we look at it, we have Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, other mandatory spending, which is interest and a couple other things. Defense is only about 13%, although it depends on the year. It's between 13 and 15%. Once again, these are kind of all over the place with regards to year, but you get the general idea. And then there's the evil non-defense discretionary spending. So what is non-defense discretionary spending? It's basically everything that the federal government does, and this is pretty much the same in most Western countries, that is not either social spending or the military or debt interest. So basically everything else. So like in the US, this would be Department of Education, National Parks, NASA, Department of Energy, road construction, some of veterans healthcare, environmental protection, housing programs, the FBI, federal courts and prisons, National Institutes of Health, the CDC. This includes foreign aid in the State Department. This includes the salaries paid to those evil, greedy civil servants. And foreign aid, the thing that constantly gets brought up, it's around 1% of the budget. It's not that much money. I mean, it's probably tens or hundreds of billions of dollars, but it's not actually going to help the problem, even if it was reduced to zero. So conservatives love to complain, but I mean, it depends on who you're talking to. But do they really want to abolish the federal prison system, the FBI, NASA, road construction? I don't know. Now, a lot of this stuff does need to be cut. Don't get me wrong. Like it does need to be cut or shut down, not even for the monetary spendings, but because it's bad for society. But my point is, if we're looking at this from a solving the deficit or debt problem, it's not really going to do it. As kind of an aside, one of the things that kind of made me break with libertarianism and kind of conservative libertarianism is during one of the budget shutdowns or the government shutdowns under Obama. I remember Glenn Beck was the head of the conservative movement back then. And he said that they have to privatize national parks. And that's part of the problem of the deficit, despite them making up 0.06% of the budget. Now, I don't think that's a super common opinion, but I don't know. It's kind of emblematic to me. Okay, but what about other countries? Now, the U.S. we know is a disaster, but what about the other countries in the world? Now, ChatGPT made this for me, so take this with a massive grain of salt, but this looks about right to me. So other countries don't really have mandatory spending in the same way, but there are things like in Canada, Medicare, the Canadian pension plan, unemployment insurance, old age security, like the guaranteed baseline social programs that really can't be cut and are kind of the baseline. That money is automatically allocated. Even if countries wanted to cut them, in a lot of cases, there's constitutional limits, like saying that the government has to provide healthcare and has to provide unemployment insurance, and all these rights are codified. So they legally have to keep the spending at the current levels, and there isn't really anything they can do beyond having a constitutional referendum. Now, people might say, but Arjun, surely the public will change their mind when they realize that this is a disaster, that this is going to lead to the total destruction of their societies. They'll accept that we have to collectively sacrifice and bunker down. No, that's not the case. Generally speaking, and I had trouble finding this for other countries, but it's about the same throughout the developed world. Public opposition to cutting pensions and healthcare is 70 to 90%. There is a super majority, it's a majority of, I think Republicans are opposed to cutting Social Security, a supermajority of independents and Democrats, if memory serves. Welfare is a little bit lower at 50 to 60%, but still a majority of the population are against it. So it's one of the issues that there's the most consensus on, more than just about anything else in society, that we don't want to cut anything, regardless of the consequences. So, once again, let's maybe look at this again. In an American context where we have a breakdown a bit more. So we have opposition to cutting federal programs. Veteran benefits, okay, that makes sense. Social Security, 80% are against cutting. Medicare, 75% around. Infrastructure, Medicaid. So, like, the three biggest ones that make up by far over half of federal spending cannot be cut or limited or rolled back. In the case of France, when they tried to raise the retirement age, there was mass riots, and that's pretty consistent throughout the collective West. Now, if we look at the population in most Western countries, it is aging relatively quite quickly. And that means that the population is increasingly going to have retired people or people dependent on Medicaid or Medicare or Social Security or various other programs, and they are going to vote against them. In some countries, particularly in Europe, you will have parties that are solely made up of like older people and former government employees who run on the single issue of keeping the pensions flowing. Now, some countries, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a minute, have their pension funds diversified. They'll own other things, like not just government bonds within the country that they're based in. They'll hold stocks, they'll hold real estate, they'll hold corporate debt, they'll hold bonds from other countries. So at least there's assets there, and at least it's generating a profit. But Social Security is held entirely in US Treasury bonds, which is just another form of debt. And that's where we get all the talk about unfunded liabilities. So what do the conservatives, what do the Republicans, the libertarians say we do with this? So if we were going to take like the maximalist conservative objectives, that is, we're going to cut every single thing that they want to cut to a degree that's not politically possible. So 100% of foreign aid, EPA, arts, public media, Department of Education. We cut food stamps and housing, aka welfare, other stuff, including civil servants, Obamacare, we repeal that. Defense, we hold the same or increase, but there's no cuts to Social Security, and we keep the Trump tax cuts. If all this was done, the deficit would fall from 1.6 trillion to 1 trillion. So it's a little better, I guess, but you're cutting off a lot of stuff. Now, like I said, some of this stuff does need to get nuked, but I don't know, like cutting funding for infrastructure it's not that much of a budget. Cutting funding for like NASA and stuff like that, I don't know. Once again, people are free to disagree with me. But the point is, it doesn't really matter. And now we have the big, beautiful bill, and that will raise defense spending by $200 billion and non-defense spending by $100 billion, and then cut taxes by $375 billion. So if conservatives were to get their maximal cuts, then Trump's new bill would still raise the average, like the deficit by like $75 billion. They aren't going to get these cuts. So the big, beautiful bill is going to cut taxes, increase spending, and remove the debt limit because why not? As I said, social spending is a sacred doctrine. It's untouchable. Even Republicans won't touch it. Even if it's something like, well, maybe we can raise the retirement age for like future generations that haven't paid into Social Security yet. So it's technically not defrauding them. You can't even do that. You can't even talk about that. And then we have what I like to call the growth cope. Now, the growth cope is what conservatives will say whenever they say, okay, we're cutting taxes. They're going to raise the deficit now, but they'll boost growth. We have to grow the economy while keeping spending stable, and that'll fix the deficit because we'll be collecting more taxes at the same rates. So once again, I asked ChatGPT. So once again, I don't know if it calculated it properly, but this seems reasonable to me. If we had no growth in federal government spending in the U.S., if we had 2% growth, it would reduce the deficit from 6.1% of GDP to 5.6% of GDP. Even if we had unrealistically high growth, like Trump makes America great again and we get 4%, I think the projected is 1.8%, and the average of the last 30 years or so is 2%. That would reduce the deficit from 6% of GDP to 4.5% of GDP over the next 5 years. And if we were going to look at it with the likely growth in defense, in federal government spending, which ChatGPT said 5%, which I'm not sure if that's exactly correct, but for the sake of illustration, that makes sense. Even if we have unreasonably high growth, it will still increase the percentage of the deficit as a part of the GDP. So the growth thing is a cope. It's maybe if this was like a smaller deficit, this would make some kind of sense. I've talked about this in the past, but it's so high and there's no way to prevent it from growing that it's just it's not really gonna matter. Okay, so we can't do cuts. What else is there? We can tax the rich. That's the one we always hear. You got to tax the rich. The rich don't pay any taxes. Now, look, I don't like a lot of the upper class as much as anybody, but to be real, the rich do pay their fair share. In most countries, if we look at the top marginal tax rate, now that's not the effective tax rate. That's a bit different. But this is on income above however much, 250,000 or whatever. This is the proportion of their income that they have to pay. Now, this does not include payroll taxes, wealth taxes, corporate taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, investment taxes. So it's pretty high. It's up there. It's 40% to half their income, in some countries above that. And if you look at the actual percentage of taxes that the top 1% pay, they are kind of funding the government. I think it's something like a majority of American households don't pay net federal taxes. So like you can complain about Elon Musk, you can complain about Bill Gates, you can complain about Warren Buffett. And look, I have my issues with them, but the reality is them and people like them are basically funding the US government at this point in time, in terms of tax revenue at least. Like just under half comes from 1% of the population. I should have put in their percentage of income. It's not particularly important. You get the idea. I'm just saying the idea that the rich people don't pay a significant proportion of the tax burden is just not true. Also, the OECD, I looked it up, said that tax evasion is only about 15 to 20%. It's not as high as I think a lot of people think it is. I'd imagine, though, that differs a bit. Obviously, there wouldn't be much tax evasion, or maybe there would be at really low levels, and the IRS just doesn't bother to even go after them. But if we had 100% tax compliance, if we shut down all the offshore accounts, the deficit would shrink to 1.4 trillion. It wouldn't really solve anything. So yeah, they just have to pay their fair share. Okay, so they're paying 40 to 50% at the moment. That's too low. That's too low. They're going to have to pay more. So let's assume that the top marginal tax rate was increased to 50%. And we lived in miracle land where there was 100% compliance, and this did not increase tax evasion, cause capital flight, or discourage people from making money through income. That would not solve the problem. It would slightly narrow the gap. If we did 65%, that would not solve the problem. It would be close. But if we were to do 80%, if we were to tax the top 1%, or not the top 1%, if we were going to make the marginal tax rate the highest at 80%, and there's 100% compliance, no tax evasion, no capital flight, no recession caused by obscenely high tax rates, no disincentive to investment, and spending stays the same, this will solve the problem. Now, obviously, there's other things like wealth taxes. I didn't really want to get into it, but even if you seized all the assets of everybody in America who's in the top 1%, I think it would fund the federal government for like a couple of years at most, at the cost of completely destroying America's economy. And it's not like we haven't been trying to tax the rich and raising taxes to pay for things. It's gotten higher. Literally in France, more than half of every dollar that is generated within the economy is taken in taxes. Even in the United States, the land of the free and the home of the brave, it's 30% of GDP. So they have tried raising taxes. In some countries, they've raised them by a lot. And it really hasn't helped. Once again, just going into the taxes a bit more. Even given this, let's just take a look at this chart. So this is the percentage of people who are receiving government benefits. I believe that the percentage of people who receive some benefits from the government is now above 50%. So as we look at it this way, okay, so we have the tax revenue going up, but in 1960, 19% of the American population received social spending. And now it's 45%. It's more than doubled. Medicare and Medicaid didn't even like exist back then. And now they're used by 15 to 16% of the population. I forget what other is. I think that's like food stamps and things like that. Maybe Obama tax credits, but yeah, and it looks like this in pretty much every country. This number keeps going up and up and up. And you depend more and more on the upper class tax base to provide for it. And once again, if memory serves, more than half of the US population does not pay a net amount of taxes. Although if I'm wrong, feel free to call me on that. So this is not going to get better. We have this percentage is going to go up. We have a lot of people retiring, more people going on disability in a lot of cases because they can't find work, so they pretend to have a disability. We have obesity, that's a big one. The pandemic of mental health issues. People have destroyed their bodies through drugs. Also, just all the immigrants, in many cases, whose wages are subsidized. And you go, well, but aren't they're productive members of society? Yeah, but they'll often bring a whole bunch of dependents with them. And there'll be a net drain on the system, just in purely financial terms. And the problem is a lot of these programs depend on there being more money paid into them than paid out. So the idea, like with Social Security, is that payroll taxes will cover the people who are currently receiving it. And that's kind of how you keep the Ponzi scheme going. But the problem is with an aging population and lower youth unemployment rates, they're not able to pay in enough to fund the retirement of the older population. And so, like I said, there's just so many feedback loops going on. So what is the Liberal plan to solve this? We need unlimited third world immigration. Canada needs to have a population of 100 million by the end of the century. How that will fix the problem, I don't know. That's going to reduce the tax base. It's going to reduce the percentage of the population that's retired because no immigrants bring their grandparents with them or disabled people or stuff like that. None of them do that. So that's priority number one. Number two, we have to make the rich and corporations pay their fair share. Even if it's not actually going to resolve the problem, they have to pay. If they would just pay it, that it would resolve the problem. And you'll see this, like, even if you crunch the numbers and you try to explain it to them, they will just yell about the rich have to pay their fair share. We have like these big utopian projects like the Green New Deal. We have the whole Keynesian thing where we just have to spend even more money and then the multipliers will solve it. And the problem is that there is an unlimited number of worthy projects that can be funded, but there's only a limited amount of money. You could just make up any kind of project like, oh, I want to give milk to underprivileged kids in my neighborhood who aren't receiving it from another program, or I want to pay people to make origami for all the elderly people in retirement homes and in hospitals, or I want to give disadvantaged youth. Like, there's an unlimited number of things that you can come up with, but you just can't fund them all. And this cannot be accepted. I mean, the thing, though, is ultimately, I think on some level, some of them are smart enough to get it, but they don't really care. It's even if the spending is ruinous, even if it's bad for society, even if it will create more suffering in the long term, we have to save the whales and we have to feed the children, even if it bankrupts us, even if it's going to create a dark and dreary future for those children. So, what is the current consensus? There's a quiet consensus across Western governments that this problem is politically and mathematically insolvable. It's easier to just stop thinking about it. Compared to the 2000s, aughts, and early 2010s, the issue has mostly vanished from serious political discourse. We still get it come up periodically, but no one really seriously talks about making the necessary cuts. You had a couple people talking about privatizing Social Security or cost sharing or something during the 90s and early Bush administration, but that proved to be politically impossible. So it was decided the least bad option was just to let the machine lurch along until it eventually destroys itself. So the discussion now is, how long can we keep the lights on? How long can we move money around? Can we print money? We can do shenanigans to make this sustainable in the short to medium term. The question isn't, should we be running massive deficits? It's, what should we spend the money on? What is the priorities? Should the money be spent on tax cuts or should it be spent on DEM programs? And that's more of the kind of question. We also just, like I said, have a lot of shenanigans. We're not going to go into detail about this. I looked into it. There's so many just bizarre things. Like, a big one is, I think it's called quantitative easing. I think it's quantitative easing or debt monetization. Like, what a lot of governments will do is they will print bonds and then lend money to themselves. So they'll collect money from bonds that they're lending. So like I think how it works is like the central bank will buy the bonds for money that they print, and they'll use that as a way to fund the government. Now, the government owns the central bank, so the interest from the payments to the loans that the government owns to itself theoretically go back into the system, and that's how, like, the Bank of Japan is somehow able to continue. You also have governments will pressure pension funds, institutional investors, lots of people like that, often kind of like it sure would be a shame if something was going to happen to your licenses, something kind of like that, to keep it going. Japan is, once again, particularly bad for this. Japan shows how much shenanigans can really go. As like I said, they're at like 240% debt to GDP ratio, and they're still printing that sweet, sweet money. Like I said earlier, countries like Canada, where at least some of the pension is in real equity, is a little less bad, but America, it's 100% government debt that the government owns to itself. So it's probably just going to limp along for a time, maybe even decades. No one wants to call the bluff. Neither the creditor nor the borrowers want to say that this whole thing is a disaster and point out that it's unsustainable. So there's kind of this silent consensus that of don't ask, don't tell in a fiscal sense. I think there's a bit of a wait and see. Maybe something will happen. Maybe there'll be an AI revolution. Maybe we'll be able to default. Maybe there'll be some other thing that will dramatically change the fiscal situation, and then we can just pay all the debt off. And there's just kind of a vague hope. Now, there's countries like the USA and Japan who issue debt in their own money. So if America was basically bankrupt and interest reached, let's just say, 100% of their debt to GDP ratio, and their debt was like $50 trillion or something, or sorry, that their interest is 100% of their federal budget, the US could just print $50 trillion bills and pay it off. Now, is this a good idea? No. Would this cause massive inflation, massive loss of investor confidence, and be a fiscal disaster? Yes, but they wouldn't go bankrupt or default. Japan has the same issue. Some countries that don't control money printing, like in Europe, they're screwed. There's nothing they can really do. Unless the EU central bank decides to print money to help them out, they're going to have to default. Actually, just a side anecdote, Russia defaulted recently because they're cut off from the global financial system. So I don't think it was a very big payment. I think it was like $20 million or something like that. But they defaulted on it because the US wouldn't allow them to pay the payment despite them having the money and being willing to. So don't fear the fiscal reaper. And we're going to take a look at our friends at Turning Point USA and Benjamin Franklin. When the people find they can vote themselves money, that will herald the end of the republic. Ultimately, the problem is democracy. Under the current system, there's no incentive to think long term because election cycles are 4 years and some countries have term limits. And some countries have functional term limits where governments will turn over every 8 years or so. The goal is to come to power by getting just enough of the population and to loot the state and take money from the people who didn't vote for you and give it to the people who do vote for you. And it's kind of like musical chairs. You want to run up the debt and deficit as much as possible and then lose an election, and then the next guy has to deal with it and dishonestly blame them for the mess that you caused. And people, once again, will vote to keep this thing going regardless of what happens. So what can be done? Unless there is a transition to another governmental system through a coup or something like that, there's no real reason to worry about it. They're never going to cut them programs. They're never going to cut Social Security. They're never going to cut Medicare. All you can really do is try to make them divert the money to things that actually would help normal people. I mean, to your people, like people who you care about, people who make up your value system. I don't think I need to go into more detail than that at the moment. But that is why Western countries are economically screwed, why they are in a death spiral, and why there's basically nothing you can do about it. So in the words of Blue Oyster Cult, don't fear the Reaper.